In the shattered heart of Tokyo, August 1945, something happened that no history book fully captured, no photograph adequately preserved, and no official report could truly explain. Before we dive into this extraordinary moment that changed everything for the people who witnessed it, I want you to do something for me. Pause for just a second and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from, what country, what city, because what happened in those ruins transcends borders, transcends time, and I promise you by the end of this story, you'll understand why your answer matters more than you think. Now, imagine this. The war is over. The bombs have stopped falling. The surrender has been signed. But for the mothers of Tokyo, standing in the wreckage of what were once their homes, the war was far from over. It lived in their chests with every breath, in their minds with every shadow, in their children's frightened eyes with every unfamiliar sound. For years they had been told stories, fed propaganda, taught to believe that the Allied soldiers were monsters, demons in human form who would show no mercy, no compassion, no humanity. And now, those very soldiers were walking through their streets. British occupation forces, battle-hardened men who had fought their way across continents, were now the authority in their devastated city. The fear was suffocating, absolute, paralyzing. But this story isn't really about the mothers, not at first. This story begins with a man who should never have been there at all. Captain James Whitmore, 42 years old, stood at the edge of what used to be a residential district in eastern Tokyo, surveying a landscape that looked like the surface of a broken moon. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames, smoke still rising from ruins weeks after the last firebombing. Children's toys scattered among the rubble, faded and forgotten. His uniform was clean but worn. His eyes carried a weight that had nothing to do with military rank. And his hands, calloused and strong, held a worn leather journal that never left his side. To his men, Captain Whitmore was an enigma. He was quiet where other officers were loud, gentle where protocol demanded sternness, and possessed an unusual quality that made even the most hardened soldiers feel unexpectedly safe in his presence. There was something about the way he looked at the ruins, not with the victor's pride or the conqueror's satisfaction, but with a profound, almost personal grief that he never explained. What his men didn't know, what the military records carefully omitted, was that Captain James Whitmore had no business being a soldier at all. Before the war, before the uniforms and the orders and the impossible decisions, James had been a primary school teacher in a small village outside London. More than that, he had been a father, a husband, a man whose greatest joy was reading stories to children, drawing whimsical illustrations in the margins of their homework, and believing that the world, for all its flaws, was fundamentally good. That world had ended on a cold November night in 1940 when a German bomb fell on his home during the London Blitz. His wife, Margaret, and their 7-year-old daughter, Emily, had been killed instantly while he was away volunteering at a shelter. The guilt, the rage, the hollow devastation had driven him to enlist at an age when most men were considered too old for combat. He had fought not for glory, not for country, but for something to do with the unbearable weight of his grief. And now, standing in Tokyo's ruins, looking at destruction that mirrored his own internal landscape, James Whitmore saw something that stopped him cold. Children, dozens of them, playing in the rubble with the desperate, defiant energy of young lives refusing to be extinguished. They were thin, their clothes patched and repatched, their faces smudged with dirt. But they were laughing, actually laughing, chasing each other through the wreckage, kicking a ball made of bundled rags, creating joy in a world that had offered them only ashes. And watching them, standing at a careful distance, were the mothers, frozen, silent, their faces masks of controlled terror, as they noticed what their children had not yet seen. British soldiers, James's soldiers, approaching down what used to be a street. The change in the mothers was instant and visceral. Bodies went rigid, hands reached protectively toward children, eyes dropped to the ground in a gesture of submission that made James's stomach turn. This was the face of fear. Pure, absolute, bone-deep fear. "Captain, sir, we should keep moving. The command post is expecting our report." The voice belonged to Major Richard Thompson, James's immediate superior, a career military man whose face was all sharp angles and harder edges. Thompson was everything the Army valued: efficient, uncompromising, and absolutely convinced of British superiority. He had fought in Burma, seen friends die in the Pacific, and carried a contempt for the Japanese that he made no effort to hide. These people made their choices. They supported their emperor, They cheered when Pearl Harbor was bombed. I don't care if they're frightened now. They should be. Thompson's words were cold, clinical, delivered with the certainty of a man who had organized the world into simple categories. Us and them, victors and defeated, the righteous and the damned. Standing slightly behind Thompson was Sergeant William Davies, a younger man whose face still carried the smooth features of youth, but whose eyes were ancient with grief. Davies had lost 2 older brothers in the Pacific campaign, one at Okinawa, one on a hospital ship torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. His hatred was different from Thompson's, more raw, more personal, more dangerous. "They're lucky we're not the Japanese army, sir," Davies said, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "The things they did in Nanking, in Singapore, the way they treated our POWs. These people deserve everything they get." His hand rested on his rifle with an intimacy that made James uneasy, a gesture that spoke of a man looking for an excuse, any excuse to make someone pay for his pain. But James wasn't listening anymore. His attention had fixed on a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, who had chased the rag ball too far, and now stood directly in the path of the approaching British soldiers. The boy froze, the ball forgotten at his feet, his dark eyes enormous with terror as he looked up at these giants in unfamiliar uniforms. Behind him, a woman, presumably his mother, had her hand pressed to her mouth, stifling what might have been a scream or a sob. The silence that fell over the ruins was profound, heavy with years of propaganda and fear, and the terrible weight of the unknown. Every muscle in the mother's body was tense to run to her child. But something held her back. Perhaps the knowledge that any sudden movement might be seen as aggression, might provoke the very violence she feared. What happened next would be reported in exactly 1 military log, mentioned in passing by 1 war correspondent's forgotten article, and remembered for the rest of their lives by every person present. Captain James Whitmore did something that violated every protocol, contradicted every order, and ignored every boundary that military occupation required. He knelt down, right there in the rubble, in full view of his men, his superiors, and the terrified mothers. James slowly, carefully, lowered himself to the child's eye level. He removed his officer's cap, setting it aside in the dirt, and from his jacket pocket he pulled out a small wooden toy, a carved rabbit, crudely made but clearly crafted with care. James had been making them for weeks, in the quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come, whittling them from scrap wood with a knife that had been meant for far darker purposes. He had told himself it was just something to do with his hands, a habit from his old life. But now, holding it out to this terrified child, he knew it had been more than that. It had been hope. A small, foolish, persistent hope that somewhere in all this destruction, something gentle might still be possible. "Captain Whitmore, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Thompson's voice cracked like a whip across the silence, sharp with disbelief and barely contained fury. "Get up, now. You're making us look weak. You're undermining everything." But James didn't move. He kept his hand extended, the wooden rabbit resting in his palm, and in soft, halting Japanese, words he had been secretly learning from a battered phrasebook over months of sleepless nights, he said something that made every Japanese mother within earshot gasp. "Kowaku nai yo. Daijubu. Tomodachi. Don't be afraid. It's okay. Friends." The shock was electric. A British officer speaking Japanese, offering a toy, kneeling in the dirt like a supplicant rather than a conqueror. It shattered every assumption, violated every expectation, and created a moment of such profound cognitive dissonance that for several heartbeats, no one moved. The little boy looked at the rabbit, then at James's face, searching for the monster he had been told lived there, and finding instead something his young mind couldn't quite process: kindness. Genuine, undemanding kindness from the most unexpected source imaginable. "This is unacceptable." Thompson's voice had risen now, authority giving way to genuine anger. "You're fraternizing with the enemy, Captain. You're setting a precedent that will destroy discipline. These people need to understand their place, need to respect our authority, and you're—" He stopped abruptly as James finally stood, but not in submission. There was something in the captain's eyes, a quiet, immovable resolve that even Thompson, for all his bluster, recognized as dangerous to challenge. "They are not the enemy, Major." James's voice was quiet, but it carried across the ruins with perfect clarity. "The war is over. These are civilians. These are mothers protecting their children. And if we cannot recognize that, if we cannot see their humanity, then what exactly did we fight for?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Around them, other soldiers had stopped, drawn by the confrontation, their expressions ranging from confusion to support to outright hostility. The Japanese mothers had inched closer, drawn by the inexplicable sight of an Allied officer defending them to his own superior. The tension was a physical force, pressing down on everyone, demanding resolution. Sergeant Davies stepped forward, his young face twisted with pain and rage. "You don't know what you're talking about, sir, with all due respect. You didn't see what I saw. You didn't lose what I lost. My brothers, good men, died fighting these people. And you want me to smile and hand out toys like it's all forgiven?" His voice cracked on the last word, revealing the wound beneath the anger, the grief that had nowhere to go except into hate. "They don't deserve your kindness. They don't deserve your sympathy. They deserve to remember what they did, what their country did, for the rest of their lives." James looked at Davies, really looked at him, seeing the boy beneath the soldier, the brother beneath the sergeant. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but unflinching. "And what about what we did, Sergeant? The firebombing of this city killed over 100,000 civilians. The atomic bombs killed hundreds of thousands more. Do these mothers, these children playing in the ruins of their homes, do they deserve to pay for their government's crimes forever? Does punishment have no end? Does grief justify cruelty?" He paused, letting the question settle. "You lost brothers. I lost everything. My wife, my daughter, my entire reason for living was taken from me in one night when a German bomb fell on my home. I know what it is to hate. God knows I know. But I also know that hate is a fire that burns the one who carries it more than anyone else. And if we cannot find a way to put that fire out, then the war truly never ends. It just moves from the battlefield into our hearts and stays there until we die." The revelation landed like a physical blow. James never spoke about his past, never mentioned his loss, maintained such perfect professional distance that most of his men didn't even know he had been married. Davies's expression cycled through shock, confusion, and something that might have been shame. Even Thompson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. But James wasn't finished. He turned back to the Japanese mothers, who had been watching this exchange with growing comprehension, their faces reflecting the realization that these soldiers, these men they had feared as monsters, were just as broken, just as grieving, just as human as they were. "I need 5 minutes," James said. Not to Thompson or Davies, but to his entire assembled unit. 5 minutes to try something. If it doesn't work, if I'm wrong, then we'll proceed with standard occupation protocols and I'll accept whatever disciplinary action command deems appropriate. But if there's even a chance that we can do this differently, that we can show these people that we're not the demons their propaganda told them we were, then isn't that worth trying? He didn't wait for permission. James walked directly toward the group of mothers, each step deliberate and slow, his hands clearly visible and empty except for that wooden rabbit. The mothers tensed, but didn't flee. Somewhere in the last few minutes, their fear had transmuted into something else, not trust exactly, but perhaps the beginning of curiosity. The first tentative question mark where before there had been only certainty of danger. James stopped at a respectful distance and executed a formal bow. The kind he had seen in photographs, studied in books, practiced in secret. It was clumsy, probably incorrect, but the sincerity was unmistakable. When he straightened, he said in his halting Japanese, "I am sorry, for war, for bombs, for fear. Children not enemy, you not enemy, we not enemy, just people, want peace." The words were simple, grammatically imperfect, but their impact was devastating. Several mothers began to cry, not from fear now, but from the sheer shock of hearing an Allied soldier apologize, seeing an occupier bow, witnessing the impossible. One mother, braver or more desperate than the rest, stepped forward. She was perhaps 30, though hardship had aged her, her clothes worn but clean, her bearing dignified despite everything. She bowed in return, deeper and longer than James had. And when she rose, her eyes were filled with tears that sparkled in the afternoon light. She spoke rapidly in Japanese, words tumbling out in a torrent that James couldn't fully follow, but he caught fragments. Husband, dead. Okinawa, soldier too. Thought you would hurt. Children, everything. Don't know what to do. She was trembling, and James realized she was telling her story, offering her own loss, her own fear, creating a bridge across the vast chasm of language and culture and war with the universal language of grief. Without thinking, operating purely on instinct and the memory of a life before war, James reached into his jacket and pulled out his leather journal. He flipped to a page near the middle and held it out to her. On the page was a drawing, a pencil sketch he had made weeks ago during a sleepless night. It showed a small child, rendered with the kind of detail that came from years of practice and oceans of love, laughing as she reached for a butterfly. It was Emily. His Emily. Captured in graphite and memory, preserved against the inexorable tide of forgetting. The mother looked at the drawing, then at James's face, and in that moment, an entire conversation happened without words. She understood. She knew. This soldier had lost a child too. This man in the uniform of an occupier was also a father who would never again hear his daughter's laughter. The mother's hand came up to cover her heart, and she whispered something that James didn't need a translation to understand. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry too." The recognition between them was total, profound, and in its own way, sacred. Two parents from opposite sides of a war, connected by the universal devastation of outliving their children. What happened next seemed to occur spontaneously, though later some would swear James had orchestrated it. Other soldiers, watching this exchange, began to move forward. Not all of them. Thompson and a handful of others held back, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. But enough. Enough men who were tired of being hard, tired of being angry, tired of being afraid, and who saw in James's simple act of humanity a permission they hadn't known they were waiting for. A young private, couldn't have been more than 19, knelt down and started helping one of the children rebuild a collapsed toy house from broken bricks. A corporal who had been carrying a chocolate bar in his ration pack for weeks, saving it for some special occasion he could never quite define, broke it into pieces and handed them out to a group of wide-eyed children who stared at the treasure like it was gold. Another soldier, older, with gray in his stubble, produced a harmonica from his pocket and began to play a simple, cheerful tune that transcended language. And slowly, incrementally, with the caution of people who had been hurt too many times to trust easily, the Japanese mothers allowed their children to approach. Not all at once, not a rush, but one by one, parents making the impossible decision to believe that perhaps these men might not be monsters after all. The little boy who had frozen in fear now held James's wooden rabbit like it was the most precious thing in the world. A girl of perhaps 8, with a serious face and intelligent eyes, approached the soldier with the harmonica and listened intently before attempting to hum along. A toddler, too young to understand propaganda or war, simply reached up to touch a soldier's beard with the universal curiosity of childhood, and the soldier, tears streaming down his face, let him. The transformation of the scene was almost miraculous. Where moments before there had been tension and fear, now there was something that looked almost like joy. Children's laughter, that purest of sounds, began to echo through the ruins. Soldiers who hadn't smiled in months found their faces arranging themselves into unfamiliar expressions of delight. Mothers who had been paralyzed with terror now watched with a mixture of disbelief and tentative hope as their children played with men who, in another context, had been tasked with destroying everything they held dear. The surreal juxtaposition of soldier and child, occupier and occupied, war and peace existing in the same moment, created a tableau that seemed to suspend time itself. But not everyone was moved. Major Thompson stood apart, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, his entire body rigid with disapproval. Beside him, a figure no one had initially noticed stepped forward, a man in civilian clothes with a camera around his neck and a journalist's notebook in his hand. This was Gerald Pritchard, a war correspondent for the Times, sent to document the occupation for readers back home who wanted to know how the defeated enemy was being handled. Pritchard had been observing in silence, but now he spoke, his voice carrying the crisp accent of British upper class and the moral certainty of someone who had never questioned his own righteousness. "This is quite the touching display, Captain Whitmore. But I wonder if you've considered the optics. Britain expects its occupation forces to maintain proper distance, to demonstrate the price of aggression, not to coddle the children of those who supported one of the most barbarous regimes in modern history. How will this look in print? How will you explain to the mothers back home who lost sons that their soldiers are playing games with enemy children?" James turned to face Pritchard, and something in his expression made the journalist take an involuntary step back. "I won't need to explain it," James said quietly, "because those mothers, the ones who lost sons, they would understand exactly what's happening here better than you ever could. They would understand that these children are not the enemy. They would understand that perpetuating cycles of hatred is not justice. And they would understand that their sons died hoping for a world where this," he gestured to the scene around them, where this might be possible. His voice gained strength. No longer the quiet murmur of before, but something clear and unwavering. But since you asked about optics, Mr. Pritchard, let me tell you what I see. I see a little boy who was terrified 3 minutes ago now laughing. I see mothers who expected to be raped or killed discovering that not all soldiers are monsters. I see British men remembering that they are human beings first and warriors second. And I see the very first seeds of a peace that might actually last, not a peace imposed by force and fear, but a peace built on the radical idea that we are all just people trying to survive in a world we didn't choose. Pritchard's pen had been moving frantically across his notebook, capturing every word, his expression shifting between fascination and calculation. And what about justice, Captain? What about accountability? Are we to simply forget what the Japanese military did? The atrocities? The war crimes? It was a legitimate question, one that hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Several soldiers had stopped what they were doing, listening, waiting to hear how their captain would answer. "We forget nothing," James said, his voice like stone. "The men who planned and executed war crimes should face justice. The military leaders who started this war should answer for their choices. But these women, these children, they didn't choose war. They didn't choose their government's actions any more than a London child chose to be in the path of a German bomb. Holding them accountable for their leaders' crimes is not justice. It's just revenge wearing a different mask. And revenge has never, in the history of humanity, created lasting peace. It only plants the seeds of the next war." "Fucking traitor!" The words came from Sergeant Davies, spoken under his breath but loud enough to be heard. Davies's face had gone red. His hands clenched into fists, his entire body shaking with the force of conflicting emotions. "You stand there, talking about peace and humanity, while my brothers are in the ground. You want me to smile and play with these kids while their fathers probably killed my brothers? You want me to forget? You want me to forgive?" His voice had risen to a shout, years of suppressed grief finding an outlet in rage. I can't do that. And you're a traitor and a coward for asking me to." The word traitor seemed to echo through the ruins, turning every head, freezing every interaction. The Japanese mothers pulled their children closer, the brief détente shattering under the weight of renewed hostility. James stood very still, his expression carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or recognition. The look of a man who had been expecting this moment and dreading it in equal measure. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden silence, everyone heard every word. "You're right," James said, and the admission shocked everyone, most of all Davies. "You're absolutely right. I am asking you to do something that feels impossible. I'm asking you to look at the children of the nation that killed your brothers and see children, not enemies. I'm asking you to take your grief, your righteous, justified, understandable grief, and transform it into something else. And that is one of the hardest things any human being can be asked to do." He took a step toward Davies, closing the distance between them until they stood face to face, officer and enlisted man, two broken people in different uniforms. "But I'm not asking you to forget, William. I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't happen. I'm asking you to choose what you do with your pain. Because you can use it as a weapon, let it harden you until you become the very thing you fought against, a person who can look at children and see enemies, who can witness innocence and only feel rage. Or you can use it as a teacher. Let it make you understand that every mother here has felt what your mother felt. That every child here could have been your brothers when they were young. Before the war, before the propaganda, before everything went to hell." James paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that made even Thompson listen. "I know about impossible grief, Sergeant. I know what it is to wake up every morning and wonder why you survived when everything you loved is gone. I know the temptation to turn that grief into hate because hate is easier. Hate gives you something to do with the pain, gives you a target, gives you purpose. But I also know that hate is a poison. It doesn't hurt the people you hate nearly as much as it hurts you. It turns you into a stranger to yourself. And one day you wake up and realize that the war took your brothers, but hate took you." The words hung in the air, devastating in their honesty. Davies's face had gone pale, his anger collapsing into something more vulnerable, more confused. Tears had started to track down his cheeks, and he didn't seem to notice or care. "I don't know how to stop," Davies whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to not be angry. It's all I have left of them. If I let go of this, if I forgive, then what? Then they're just gone and it meant nothing, and I have to somehow learn to live in a world where my brothers are dead, and their killers' children get to play and laugh and grow up? It was the cry of a soul in agony. A young man who had lost too much too soon and been given no tools to process any of it, except the blunt instrument of rage. James did something then that violated at least a dozen military protocols. He reached out and pulled Davies into an embrace, officer to enlisted, older man to younger, survivor to survivor. Davies resisted for perhaps a second before collapsing into it, sobbing with the kind of raw, uncontrolled grief that couldn't be contained anymore. Other soldiers looked away, uncomfortable with such vulnerability. But the Japanese mothers watched with wide eyes, understanding transcending language. Here was the truth of the occupation. Not conquering heroes, but damaged men. Not victors, but survivors, carrying wounds that no treaty could address. You honor them by living, James said quietly. His words meant only for Davies, but heard by those close enough. You honor them by becoming the man they would want you to be. And I promise you, Sergeant, your brothers would not want you to become bitter and small and cruel. They would want you to take this anger and transform it into something better. They would want you to be happy again, even though that feels impossible right now. They would want you to help build the peace they died for, not perpetuate the cycle that killed them. He held Davies until the young man's sobs began to subside, until his breathing steadied, until some of the tension bled out of his body. When they finally separated, Davies's face was blotchy and tear-stained. But something had shifted in his expression. The hard mask had cracked, revealing a younger, more uncertain face beneath. He looked around at the scene. The soldiers and the children, the mothers and the toys, seeing it perhaps for the first time not through the lens of rage but through the lens of possibility. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked toward a small boy who had been watching him with large, frightened eyes. Davies knelt down, moving carefully like someone approaching a wild animal, and from his pocket he pulled out a small photograph, worn and creased from being handled too many times. He showed it to the boy, pointing to the two young men in British uniforms who smiled at the camera with the invincible confidence of youth. My brothers, Davies said, his voice hoarse. Tom and Robert. They were good men. The boy didn't understand the words, but he understood the grief, the love, the need to share the memory with someone, anyone. The boy reached out and touched the photograph gently, reverently, and in his own language said something that made his mother gasp. The mother translated, her voice trembling, her eyes on Davies's face. He says your brothers look kind. He says his father was a soldier too. He didn't come home. He says he is sorry your brothers didn't come home either. The simplicity of it, the perfect, childlike understanding that transcended nations and ideologies and years of propaganda, broke something in Davies, or perhaps healed something. He clutched the photograph to his chest and nodded, unable to speak, tears flowing freely again, but different now, not just grief but something more complex, more human, more healing. The correspondent, Pritchard, had stopped taking notes. He stood with his notebook hanging loose in his hand, his face reflecting the same shocked recognition that was spreading through everyone present. This was not what he had come to document. This was not the story of victors and defeated, occupiers and occupied, the narratives that sold newspapers and confirmed prejudices. This was something far more subversive and far more true. The story of people, just people finding their way back to humanity after a war that had tried to destroy it.